Thank you, Karen. Thank you to Keenan for hosting this, and thank you to all the attendees to this webinar. I have been fortunate over the last 25 years or so to be able to witness crises from a variety of perspectives, both as a reporter and editor, and later on as an employee of a public sector entity, and now as a consultant to public and private sector entities, covering things like City Hall, courts, police, and business. And in that time, I have been able to observe these crises, also to learn some of the common themes that unite very diverse events. And I think maybe most helpful for our purposes today, see some of the common mistakes that are made in handling these crises, and able to learn what kinds of responses on the part of an organization tend to be the most helpful in surviving one of these crises with your reputation and your mission intact. Every crisis is different. They come in an endless variety of forms. I think what might be a crisis for one organization could be routine for another. A homicide, for example, at a city police department is, unfortunately, a relatively routine day's work. If a homicide takes place in the parking lot of a retailer, that can be the worst day and the worst week in that retailer's business life. So there is no way to pinpoint precisely what defines a crisis. For my purposes, I think it's anything that puts your organization in an uninvited spotlight. That these carry the potential to inflict permanent harm to your reputation, to your ability to execute your mission, very possibly to the viability of the organization itself. And I think of particular interest to Keenan's audience, it can do immediate and irreparable harm to the attitude and opinion of a jury pool, and to the settlement that might surround, and to the climate that surrounds settlement negotiations. So in addition to reputational damage, there is a very, very real potential for bottom line damage, either through litigation or through an impact on the business itself. I have found that when we define a crisis this way, it doesn't discriminate based on the size or sophistication level of the organization. Being small, being rural, being relatively immune from major news trends does not inoculate you or your city or your school district from being the site of the next crisis. As we speak this morning, it's entirely conceivable that an employee is conducting him or herself in a way that you will have to manage tomorrow. So it can happen anytime. Another feature common in my practice is that I see the greatest damage typically is inflicted by the attempt to respond to the crisis, often not by the originating event itself. We can talk a little bit more about the intricacies of managing these, but I think it's safe to say when I look back on the most damaging crises, the damage has been inflicted by a botched effort to manage it. So for me, the two key ingredients are how well you prepare for a crisis and how well you manage one once it begins. As we talk about managing the crisis, just very quickly, there are, I think, a category of mistakes that come from overestimating what is within your power to do. For example, it is occasionally put out there that there is a template that either a consultant or a PR agency may offer that will let you sort of check the list and make sure you're doing it right. It's been my experience that no such template exists. You can't manage these with a template. You cannot control every aspect of the crisis as it unfolds. You also cannot use this typically as an occasion to make sweeping changes in existing public opinion. The landscape that is in place as you begin this journey of managing the crisis is probably going to remain the landscape. And what I mean by that is if you are struggling against a commonly held but unfair public perception, for the example of municipal governments, we all have struggled with the stereotypical idea that city workers are inefficient or that we have, you know, 3 guys leaning on a shovel. That's unfair, that's inaccurate, but
in the midst of a crisis is probably not the time to try to fix these kinds of common misperceptions. We're going to have to navigate with the landscape that we have and worry about fixing the landscape over a much longer period of time. And finally, you cannot script the outcome. These will defy your ability to decide what everything's going to be like at the end. Other categories of mistakes, I think, come from underestimating what you can do. And at face value, these don't seem terribly dramatic, but they can be very important. And I would suggest that the three things that we can do to be better crisis managers are, first, we can understand and perhaps avoid some of the common pitfalls that tend to take place and that very smart, very sophisticated organizations continue to fall into for complex reasons we can touch on, but probably not in any great depth. You can at least know what those pitfalls are and be aware of the likelihood that they're in front of you. And I think it's helpful to understand what kinds of traits are common to successful crisis management campaigns. And then finally, you can make some basic, essential preparations to be better prepared when your turn comes. And those are the three things I'd like to focus on as we move forward. I'll say a quick word about the situation in which cities, school districts, companies find themselves at the outset, and it's useful for our purposes to sort of take litigation as a pretty good representative of the usual communications crisis. And what happens at the outset of these, by the time the city realizes that they are in a critical situation, they are already standing in a contest in which there's a tremendous mismatch between the plaintiffs and the defendants in terms of their ability to communicate. Plaintiffs' law firms, I have found, are increasingly media savvy. They have a tremendous ability to reach out to the media and to a broad spectrum of audiences. By the time they first communicate with the public, they are doing so with messages that they have developed, probably tested, and refined. They have had a tremendous amount of time to speak these messages on a, test basis, a trial basis, and figure out where the weak points are and fix those gaps so that by the time they're delivering these messages publicly, these are very well-tuned messages. Defendants, on the other hand, often are not prepared, and they are going to test their messages in real time. They're going to learn where the weaknesses are in their messages as they deliver them publicly. It's a much different dynamic. The plaintiff is also able to launch a multi-front campaign, and quite simply, in municipal life, this is why you find that whereas you thought you were dealing with just litigation, you're now dealing with a labor issue at the same time. You're dealing with protests at City Hall. You're dealing potentially with religious figures in the community who are holding vigils or meetings to discuss the issue. So suddenly you find that the plaintiff has been able to open up 5 or 6 fronts, and your institutional behavior has really been geared toward fighting on one front at a time. So the plaintiff already has you on your heels. The last 2 big advantages that plaintiffs go into these fights with is the ability to pick their audiences. They can communicate to whom they decide they most need to communicate to. As a city, as a school district, as a publicly traded company, you have built-in audiences, often whose agendas and interests conflict with each other, a much more difficult landscape to navigate. And finally, plaintiffs tend to be guided through experienced public relations counsel. Crisis management folks, message specialists, et cetera. Public sector defendants in particular often find that either through budgets or institutional culture, they have to go this alone. So the deck is stacked against you pretty badly at the very beginning. Let's talk about some of the common pitfalls. And I want to say at the outset that these are mistakes made by smart people. It's always very unsatisfying when I read about or even experience some communications mishaps, some crises that maybe get worse than they could have. And the reason for this is dismissed as this or that individual is not terribly smart or very, not tuned in, tone deaf, etc. To me, that's a less satisfying explanation than the reality, which is that very, very smart people from very sophisticated organizations somehow do find a way to say things or conduct actions that are decidedly not smart and that come across as insensitive or that really invite a deepening of the crisis. In my experience, I found that the climate for those kinds of mistakes is established by some pretty common things. First, I refer to misunderstanding your starting position. We'll talk about each of these in some detail in just a minute. Lack of a clear message as you enter the campaign, reliance on the wrong kind of messengers or insufficient messengers, a failure to understand the audiences you're communicating to, defensiveness we'll talk about, and a lack of objective guidance. And I will just spend a minute on that one before we move on. And to say this, that I don't put case studies on my website, and I don't use them, and here's the reason. If I listed out everything that I did for any of the clients that I've helped through these crises, that case study would read like the most self-evident common sense advice, that you would read that and think, well, my God, I don't need to hire someone to do that. And what I've learned, or doing this for a long, long time, is that common sense and perfectly rational decisions are extremely hard to come by when you are at the center of the crisis. And I tell my clients every week, if it were my name on the picket sign, I would probably not make any better decisions than you have been making up until this point. Common sense and clear-headedness leaves when the crisis really kicks in. So it can be very, very important to have somebody who is not part of the organization, who doesn't get a paycheck from the same place that you do, who doesn't answer to the same constituents that you do, to keep an objective eye on how things are progressing. Let's talk briefly about misunderstanding your starting position. It's been my experience that organizations, public and private, tend to overestimate their standing in public opinion. And what I mean is, you begin, say, a lawsuit or a communications challenge of any kind with a preconception of where you stand in terms of public regard, where your audiences believe you are. And in my experience, it is consistently, the real starting point is consistently less than it's perceived to be. My clients typically believe that on day one of litigation, for example, we are starting a contest at the 50-yard line, and we are engaging in a message contest to see who can advance further into the other's territory. The reality is, very often they are not starting at the 50-yard line. They're starting in the shadow of their own goalposts. And this is not because they're not bright people. This is because all of us, over time, in any organization, become surrounded by like-minded partners. We have more feedback about the good work that we do than much of our audience. And we tend to hear more and listen better to people who want to remind us of how good we are. So for a school district, for example, we begin a challenge pretty convinced that the people that tell us that we get feedback from are representative of the audiences. In fact, it turns out to be not perfectly accurate, that we tend to get more feedback and perhaps listen better to people who are supportive. So this matters because when you miscalculate your starting position, it can lead to some very serious errors in strategy. It can lead to some flawed development of the message, and it can then lead to deploying the wrong kinds of tactics. So you're talking to an audience that is in a different position than you have assumed them to be in. Quite simply, this is the reason that private sector entities will spend a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of money on opinion polling and testing to figure out exactly where their messages are. And no matter how confident they are at the beginning of that they know what everybody thinks, I have yet to see one who wasn't surprised by the reality of the public feedback. We could spend easily a week of webinars on message development. So simply, this is too brief a format to really get into the complexity of it. But I will say a couple of things that I think are worth keeping in mind as you await your turn or prepare for your turn in the spotlight. And that is that a distressing number of organizations in the midst of a conflict find out that they don't really have a message. They think they do. And what they end up presenting as their message or believing to be a message is often a collection of rebuttals from the plaintiff's claims or from the detractor's claims. Or in some cases, basically a slogan. It's the tagline that you put on the end of your emails. Neither of those things are messages. A message, very simply, is a rationale. It's a little story for why your audience should hold a certain position or take a certain action. The best messages are stories. That's how we receive and process information. And the best messages are emotional, they're relevant to the audience, and they're unique to the messenger who's delivering them. Each of those components are easily the subject of a webinar, but if you take nothing away from this, understand that you might think you have a message, but it would behoove you to run that by somebody with objective ears and test it pretty carefully. Finally, very important to make sure that your message and your messenger match up nicely. Who speaks can be as important as what is said, and mistakes are made on this venue virtually every day. One of the most common mistakes I see is assuming that your litigator, for example, is the right person to deliver your messages. This kind of double tasking of litigators I found to be very, very dangerous. They're two very different disciplines. You're asking somebody to go very aggressively in a courtroom situation and perhaps go after the plaintiffs pretty aggressively, and then to step outside of the courtroom and deliver the kind of messages that you need to on behalf of an organization that perhaps doesn't need to be seen as aggressive. That kind of mismatch is a mistake that happens every day. It happens in the private sector quite a bit. I'm adamant in the clients who have welcomed me in as a crisis manager that with school districts, for example, I want educators to sound like educators and lawyers to sound like lawyers. When a district superintendent tries to explain the law, we're off message. Something's not right about that. And similarly, if your litigation attorney is the one who's explaining the deep personal, emotional commitment you have to the children in your district, that just sounds weird. So matching the message and the messenger is critical and very easy to get wrong. Finally, a quick word about third-party messengers. In every campaign, we end up with a whole category of messages that we desperately wish could be in this debate, but they're just not appropriate for the city, not appropriate for the school district or the company to deliver. We aren't the right people to say it. And I would suggest that preparing for a crisis means giving some thought to who those third-party messengers might be that might carry your additional messages for you or echo what you're trying to say, because I can pretty well guarantee that in the litigation example, the other side will have them. Understanding your audience, a little bit related to understanding your starting position, but consistent errors are made in terms of understanding to whom you're really speaking. It's a little bit more complex than it appears, but I think the thing to keep in mind, as a public sector entity, you've got some built-in internal and external audiences. The same message may not work for both, but we certainly should be pushing in the same direction with the same theme. But with every communication, it's vital to take some time to understand who this audience is, each component of this audience. What do they know about you now? What do you need them to know about you as this thing develops? And then very, very importantly, why should they care? I try to remember in every communication that my audience is continually asking themselves some version of, do I need to care about this? Is this something that's going to matter to me? So, if I'm talking to, to residents of a densely urban city and talking about, the need for a certain amount of acreage for agriculture, I've got a real uphill climb unless I can bring it back to the reality that this means you're not going to be able to afford Brussels sprouts anymore. You've got to take everything back to what is in it for your audience. And this is, I think, why, well, we'll perhaps come back to that. We'll go on to this one, which for me is, again, could be the topic of a week-long series of seminars, defensiveness. I think the short version of this is none of us feel like we're being defensive, but all of us are, and I include myself in that. It appears in my, amateur psychologist practice, it appears to be a natural human response. Over time, whatever organization we represent or we become part of, we build, I think, stronger emotional bonds to that than we seem to realize. And so that the urge to explain our innocence, to defend our team, to save face for ourselves and our colleagues is tremendously powerful. It seems to be almost a reflex action. I don't think anyone sits down and says, well, I've got to defend our side here, and so I'm going to get liberal with my interpretation of the facts. It all appears to me to happen more or less subconsciously. And I don't claim to understand the intricacies of that, but what I do understand is that by the time I get called in, typically there are a series of unfortunate events and unfortunate communications that are pretty directly traceable to this initial defensive reaction, this willingness, this sort of compulsion, if you will, to explain why it's not as bad as it sounds, where we didn't do anything quite as bad as the plaintiff or the accuser makes it sound like we did. Again, the most natural instinct in the world, but particularly unhelpful in most situations and lethal in some situations. I have seen clients get out in front of a situation that they were supposedly investigating and already begin proclaiming the innocence of the subject of the investigation. Very smart, very seasoned law enforcement professionals make this mistake on an ongoing basis. Next time you hear a police department spokesman talk about an officer-involved shooting, listen to see if you see that natural conflict of messages. On the one hand, you will hear that this is going to be investigated very, very thoroughly, and they're going to understand everything there is to understand about this before they arrive at a decision. And then often in the next sentence, you will hear the beginnings of an exculpatory narrative of how this shooting appears to be justified. That's not helpful, but it's a mistake that happens all the time. And again, one place where it can come back to haunt you quicker than most is in issues related to past conduct. School district, for example, who is now facing litigation from abuse of students maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it is probably not helpful in any way to begin defending, the superintendent's predecessor or two superintendents ago. But again, that's a natural impulse, but one I think that has to be suppressed if you're going to avoid appearing insensitive to victims, to avoid appearing preoccupied with your own reputation, or making those other kinds of mistakes that lead people to be particularly critical. Briefly, some of the other common mistakes are the need for a clear, reasonable objective. What is it that we're trying to get done here? And that can get very confusing in the midst of the crisis. If you're in there day to day, responding to and reacting to what an accuser or detractor, or whether it's a labor union or a plaintiff or whomever is saying, you can be very, very easy to lose sight of what you're ultimately trying to get done. And again, I think that's one place where objective oversight, having somebody who can kind of serve as a lighthouse, if you will, some kind of beacon to continually keep the focus on the objective becomes very important. None of us, I think, do a terribly good job of keeping a long-term goal in mind while we're fighting a very intense short-term battle. Rethinking timelines. I have been hired more times than I can remember now by clients who have said, we just need to get past Thursday's meeting. If I can just make it through this next week, that's all we need. Everything's fine. Every one of them has learned the very difficult lesson that, no, you don't just need to get past next Thursday. These things live much, much longer than you realize. The sort of final act of this drama is dragged out over a significant amount of time, and often the real lasting damage can get done in a period that appears to be relatively quiet. That's when you get things like lawmakers deciding that they need to address this situation that was high profile a month or two ago. That's when some of the real policy changes or some of the real retrenching on the part of your antagonists takes place. So you need to think about this as a fairly long-term objective, as a fairly long-term campaign. And I've put on this slide 5 words that should make you worry, and they are these. We have to do something. We have to do something, particularly when that is spoken in this context. I've lost count of the number of times that I have been with a client at the early stages of a crisis. We've got a terribly damaging news story that perhaps misrepresents our position or the real nature of whatever actions are being reported. We've got the initial stages of reporting on a lawsuit, for example, or we've got a federal investigation of one of our products that's subject to a health recall. And you'll be sitting in the conference room, and someone in authority will say, "We've got to do something. That's our brand name out there that's being destroyed. They're out there right now, courting the television cameras to defame us. We've got to do something. We've got to get in this fight." I have learned that when you hear "we've got to do something" as the rationale for action, it is quite reliable that that action will be something that you will regret and you will spend a considerable amount of energy trying to undo. So I would just mention that as a potential signal that that generally speaking, the action that is recommended in the immediate aftermath of "we've got to do something" is probably not the one that you will wish you had done. Let's talk briefly about some common traits in successful campaigns. Organizations that tend to weather these storms well, come out with their reputation intact, with their business objectives still viable, tend to do certain things. They tend to be as candid and as transparent as the circumstances allow. Often there are sort of legal limitations. Those legal limitations, candidly, are more fluid than your legal team may lead you to believe, but they consistently attempt to be candid and to be as transparent as possible. Their communications, everything they say in the midst of this crisis, is driven by and in support of a small, carefully identified and thoroughly tested set of key messages. So they are not off talking about what the plaintiff wants to talk about. They are driving communications back to what they want to talk about. And they are communicating fairly consistently on an ongoing basis. School districts who have weathered some of the most difficult litigation over student abuse, for example, have been those ones who have understood that this is an absorbing event that has to be focused on, but that we need to continue to communicate and exist as a school district who is bigger than this, who has a mission that can't be neglected during this time. So this business of continuing to communicate as a responsible professional entity, even as the crisis unfolds, can be very key, I think, to survival. This one is complex and difficult, but I think it can be said that organizations that weather these successfully are organizations who either of their own volition or at their own peril have come to view the media as a strategic partner rather than an enemy. Again, I have lost count of the number of clients who have told me at the beginning of a relationship that they have a uniquely troublesome reporter or a particularly difficult newspaper, and that the usual sort of media relations protocols can't apply to them. I think to a one, they have all learned that comfortable or not, there is not yet a substitute for having a cordial professional relationship with their media representatives. And that's, again, something that can be explored and developed over time. They also keep the crisis in some level of perspective. They're able to understand where this fits in terms of their overall mission, and again, keep at least one eye on the long-term objectives. And they, as I mentioned before, do tend to have objective oversight of their communications and their messages. They're also what I have come to call brave enough to be humble. And I would just harken back to what we said about defensiveness. It's extraordinarily easy to be brittle. It's very, very tempting to attempt to rebut and refute everything that comes from the plaintiff. And more damaging still, it's very easy to feel that you're the victim in this. You've run an organization that is ethical, it's professional, it's staffed by people that you know to be tremendous professionals who are dedicated to their vocation, and you don't deserve this level of criticism that you're getting. We will stipulate that at the outset, that you don't deserve this beating that you're getting. And yet, the organizations that do the best tend to be the ones who are able to say throughout this, this is something that's on some level valid, that we should be held responsible for our actions, that we welcome on some level this sort of inspection, and that they minimize the amount of time they spend feeling like a victim, and instead put themselves in a more humble position. If there's no other dynamic, I think, on the cusp of one of these crises than this, this can be the most helpful, to learn that organizations that approach this with a sense of humility tend not to trigger the media's instinct to subject them to humiliating circumstances. When organizations enter a crisis and posture as though they have all of the answers, they could not possibly have done anything wrong, or that they know every line in the script to fixing the situation. Frankly, media and some element of the public feels compelled to bring you down a peg and demonstrate to you that maybe you're not seeing this in its full perspective. So a small dose of humility can yield some very, very big benefits, but it takes, frankly, it takes a brave organization to be humble in the midst of a crisis. Let's talk about preparation. And the way I think of this is just reflecting on a couple of decades of doing this, thinking back to the lists that I carry about what organizations end up wishing they had done. In every one of these, as we sort of move into the crisis, someone will say, it would have been great, would have been really good if we had known that this message or that message wasn't going to work for these reasons. It would have been really great if we had known. We spent a lot of time just gathering the right people to have a discussion that would allow us to move forward. It would be great if we had identified those people ahead of time. So here's a quick listing of some of those things that I would expect you will end up wishing you had done. First is you will wish you had thought through likely scenarios. Now, a crisis, maybe by its nature, can't be fully anticipated or predicted ahead of time, but there are likely scenarios that it's in your interest to think through. For my agriculture clients, they have got to be prepared for and have an understanding of what their response will look like when a food-borne pathogen makes its way onto a piece of their lettuce. So they have got to, as a responsible ag grower, they have got to have thought about this ahead of time. I would argue that a city, a school district, or any public entity has a fairly short list of things that it has to reasonably project could happen there. I mean, certainly there could be a police shooting that is very complicated and perhaps at first glance very difficult to explain. There's certainly a school district a responsible school district would have to foresee that they may find that an employee has physically or sexually abused students or behaved in a way that has made them liable to that kind of litigation. Those kinds of things can be reasonably projected, and you can begin to think through your response to them. You will wish you had identified a crisis response team. You will want to have, in one room or easily retrievable, the kinds of decision makers you need, representation from the board, the legal team certainly, your communications consultant, HR. These are all sort of key voices that will end up having a tremendous amount of influence. If you've thought through first who those people are and they understand that they have an identity as a member of this critical response team, you'll save a lot of time and a lot of energy assembling them. You also will wish that you had sort of tested these team dynamics, or at least thought through how this team is going to relate to each other. In most of the situations that I deal with, there is inevitably some minor conflict of perspective between our legal needs and our best course of action from a public relations point of view. And those happen in every situation. They are dealt with professionally. But I mention it because it is important to understand ahead of time, if possible, who in your organization tends to win those arguments. For a private sector company, for example, you know, when corporate communications or community services says, you know, we've got a suspected contamination of a product in a store in Arizona, we've got to get every trace of that product off the shelf so that we can proclaim that we've been very decisive and acted quickly. Well, will operations have a different point of view? Will legal say, wait a minute, that exposes us to, you know, potentially admitting fault? And if they do, who is the decision maker most likely to side with? That's very valuable information, understanding that dynamic on the front end. You'll wish you had identified key audiences, remembering both internal and external components. You will wish that you had thought about who is there to support us, who is likely to be someone that we could equip with messages to echo what we're saying, so that there are people in the community sort of speaking supportively and reminding people of our message. You will certainly wish you had identified who has been waiting for this misstep on your part their whole careers, who is going to come forward seeing you in a vulnerable position and try to open up a new front. You will wish you had identified additional messengers and experts. You'll find in the litigation example that the plaintiff's message will be echoed probably before this is over by some panel of experts and one or two academics that will be there to say, yes, you know, the plaintiff's claims are shocking but plausible, and we see this as part of a national trend. And there you will be alone. It'll be plaintiff plus expert plus professor versus you. And you will wish that you had thought about, where is my professor? Where is my subject matter expert? Where are the people that I could go to lend some objective credibility to what I'm saying? The midst of the crisis is a terrible time to try to find those people or identify them. And you will, similarly, you will wish that you had formed relationships with media and with your community opinion leaders ahead of time. There are few things in my professional life more awkward than introducing myself to a reporter in the same conversation where I'm trying to convince her or him to see a very complex issue my way. I always end up wishing that I had made that introduction in peacetime rather than when things are flying around violently. You will also wish you had drafted your key messages. Again, understanding you can't predict every nuance of every crisis, but you will certainly wish that you had thought about what are we going to say about ourselves, about who we are and what we're about when the time comes. You will wish that you had anticipated the likely questions that you would face in that situation and listened very critically with objective counsel, if at all possible, to those responses. Would I, if I were still a reporter, would I settle for that answer, or did the answer you just gave me trigger 4 or 5 new troubling questions? Those are kinds of things that you actually can do to some extent ahead of time. Very, very helpful. You will wish you had assembled key data. If you're a grower of green produce and you're suddenly in the spotlight about food safety, you will wish that you had, within easy reach, a tally of what you do right now to keep produce safe, or how many tons you moved last year. You will wish you knew how many calls for service your police department had, or at least an ability to retrieve that kind of data quickly. Again, in the midst of the fight is a very difficult time to start assembling data or opening up avenues of communication to audiences. And that is the end of the prepared remarks, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you, Michael. But before we start our Q&A period, I'd like just to state that Keenan & Associates is an insurance brokerage and consulting firm. It is not a law firm or an accounting firm. We do not give legal advice or tax advice, and neither this presentation. The answers provided during the Q&A period nor the documents accompanying this presentation constitutes or should be construed as tax or legal advice. You're advised to follow up with your own legal counsel and or tax advisor to discuss how this information affects you. So, Michael, actually, I see a question from one of our audience members, and the first one is, you suggest making the media a strategic partner, but the reporter who covers this is absolutely out to get us. He jumps on every perceived mistake and makes no effort to cover the good news. How can we trust him as our partner?
That is it's an excellent question, and I can tell you that you are far from alone. That's a perception, a reality that a lot of organizations are facing as they enter into a difficult, critical period here. I guess ultimately my answer won't be supremely satisfying to you, except that I can tell you that remaining in the place of being victimized by this reporter is ultimately not going to work for you. That sort of celebrating his awfulness is not a substitute for trying to establish yourself as a reliable source of information on this conflict. I guess I will say that I've found these situations that you describe evolve into one of two places. Either I end up concluding, yeah, you're right, this person is truly awful and we have to deal with him very carefully. We have to make sure that the only things that we say are reproducible and will be distinctly on message for us. Or, and frankly this happens more often, we end up concluding that, you know, we are not entirely guiltless in this complicated relationship with the reporter, and as we sort of begin a disciplined practice of communicating very openly, trying to be considerate of the reporter's needs and perspective, we find more often than not that relationship actually turns for the better. So ultimately there is no substitute for either cultivating or simulating a professional, cordial relationship.
We have another one, and the question is, who at the school district should be appointed as the public information officer, the superintendent, HR person, or some other individual?
Well, I don't want to cop out, but I think that depends very, very much on the district. Let me give you a couple of examples. I have dealt with one school district in particular where we had the superintendent was the sort of first point of media contact. Now, in a large, sophisticated district, there may actually be a press function or, you know, someone who's a media liaison, but I'm assuming that in many cases that's not present. In those cases, certainly the superintendent satisfies the requirements that the public and the media have, sufficiently high ranking, you know, unambiguous in terms of what their scope and purview is. So often the superintendent is a very logical first choice. But I have dealt with districts in which that turned out not to be the best choice. And that is very much a case-by-case, situation-by-situation decision. Just by way of illustrating, we were dealing with a sexual abuse case that was frankly horrifying. The confirmed actions, the proven behavior on the part of an employee some years ago were really very, very distressing. And the communications dynamic that was emerging is a very common one, where the plaintiffs were speaking emotionally about the human impact of this really awful series of crimes. And the defendant, being a defendant, was talking about not children but plaintiffs. They were talking not about, you know, crimes but alleged actions. They were in the process of sounding different than everyone else in the community who was talking about this, because it is very risky and very scary to be human and humble as you talk about these things. In that situation, we found that there was a long-serving board member who was uniquely qualified to convey the very emotional content that needed to be conveyed. So, you know, matching the message and the messenger is very much a case-by-case basis.
Michael, we have yet another question, and it says, the suggestion was to run your message by objective eyes to get feedback. Does this mean to have a few key messages that can be tailored to different situations?
it can mean that. I think what I meant in particular was, if you foresee a likely situation, what kinds of things will you want your audiences to know about you? And you certainly can't speak to actions that haven't happened yet, but when the topic is, the safety of children in a school district, or, the integrity of a city department, you can probably identify in the front end several key messages, things that you will want people to know about you above and beyond everything else. I think then, certainly they may or may not be adaptable enough to fit whatever situation befalls you, but it's very useful to at least start that process. I'm continually surprised at how many organizations, how many people don't really have a clear message going into this. And I'll just tell you that one of the populations that I found worse at this than you might expect are journalists themselves. I've been a journalist, but I've also now dealt with journalists as recipients of my counsel, and I'm continually surprised at how opaque they are on this concept. When I was talking to a reporter who was doing national media over a very contentious issue, and I asked him, "What's your message?" His response was, "Well, I think he's going to ask me this, this, and this." And I said, "Oh, no, sir. My question to you was, what is your message? What is it you are doing this interview in order to say?" And that's the kind of thinking you have to have. It's not, do I have an answer to every accusation so much as it is, what is it that I want people to know? If I could, say one thing in one sentence on a billboard outside of our headquarters, what would it be? That's the beginning of message thinking.
We have another question from one of the guests. It says, nearly all of the, quote, what you wish you would have done, quote, items require significant pre-crisis involvement in planning by the key decision makers. What is your best tip for creating the sense of urgency that leads to getting to a place where meaningful tabletop exercises can happen with the right people in the room?
That's a great question, and I think it reveals, a gap in my perspective, just as I specialize in trying to identify gaps in my clients' perspectives. Someone like me, who I would argue is, very critical to managing a crisis with some ability to retain, an objective viewpoint, I am going to be deficient in recognizing some of the internal requirements that you face, and you identify a perfect one here. It's one thing to say get everybody together, but, come to our office and try to get everybody together. So I think it's a very, very good point. One suggestion that comes to mind is, unfortunately, there's just no shortage of examples in the news that should be chilling to an organization. When you look at, $1 million plus settlements for, for actions that could have taken place really in any district, or multi-million-dollar settlements, I think those could potentially at least be a starting point to the conversation that hopefully drives the willingness of people to participate now. And I think the other thing is, while I want to talk about this with a sense of urgency and tell you how much you will wish you had done it, these individual tasks need not be particularly time intensive. I mean, for example, identifying the members of the critical response team could be, the exercise of an afternoon and maybe, one or two people from staff. And if you don't take it to the next level and talk through the scenarios, you at least have done that. So let's say, for example, you can't get them together for a simulation or tabletop exercise. You at least know who they are and how to find them if they're not in the office, and understand that they need to be at the table when the decisions are made. That in itself is some achievement. If you can do a step better than that and get them all involved in planning the exercises, so much the better.
Another participant asks, you mentioned the notion of brave enough to be humble. How can an agency be humble without exactly accepting fault, say if accusations are false?
Yeah, and that is exactly why that's a very good question, and that's why you want me or someone like me at the table telling you that, you know what, you'll get through this a lot easier if we do this with some level of humility. And you want your litigator, or at least your legal counsel, at the same table to say, not so fast. Mr. Heenan. That's all well and good from a PR perspective, but here's what that could mean for us in a litigation perspective. That kind of, steering a course between two conflicting sets of objectives is why this preparation and this level of thought is so necessary. I have been in organizations where the perspective of public relations had the upper hand, and legal really was presented with some tremendous challenges as a result. I've been in more organizations where the fear of litigation had the upper hand, and where legal's pronouncement that you can't say that, we shouldn't say anything, that carried a great deal more weight than my perspective within that organization. I'm humble enough to know that I'm not going to win every argument and that I'm not right every time, that there will be situations where the legal restrictions are very real and are, really putting a fence around our potential message territory. But I think what's important is to have that, understand that dynamic, and to the extent you can, have that discussion in peacetime, if at all possible. You can only have pieces of it. You can only sort of, see a glimpse of the puzzle from the front end. But the situation you describe, how are you humble without accepting fault? I can tell you that the lawyer is going to be particularly vigilant that you not accept fault. But I can also tell you that over time, a skilled communications, a skilled message guide can help you walk what can be a very, very fine line. And sometimes being humble might not mean anything more than the tone with which you communicate, the way in which you convey that we are not bristling at this examination. We are welcome in the examination. We don't, believe that these particular accusations are true, but that doesn't mean that we are not eager to learn everything we can from this to make sure that we are, for example, making our students as safe as we can. I guess ultimately what I'm saying is that there's ways to be humble that may not run afoul of your legal strategy, but you need two or more professionals who are willing to discuss this candidly to find that.
Well, it's been a wonderful morning having Michael here with us, and we greatly appreciate his insight and expertise. And thank you all for attending today's webinar, and we will see you next month. Thank you.